She told me, "Don't call me Mrs." And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about names, it was about everything we weren't supposed to feel. The evening had that quiet warmth only late summer knows, golden lights spilling over rooftops, cicadas buzzing lazily in the hedges, the faint scent of cut grass still clinging to the air. I had just parked my car by the curb when I noticed her across the street, arms full of grocery bags, one strap slipping precariously down her wrist. Mrs. Harris, that's what everyone called her. The elegant woman in her early 40s with calm eyes and a presence that made people instinctively straighten their backs. She wasn't flashy, but there was a kind of grace about her, the sort that didn't ask for attention but quietly earned it. I jogged over. "Here, let me help you with those." She turned, a wisp of chestnut hair escaping her loose bun, and for the first time, our eyes really met. Not in the passing neighbor kind of way, but as two people who suddenly realized they lived only a few feet apart, and had somehow never actually seen each other. "That's kind of you," she said, her voice smooth but slightly surprised, as if unaccustomed to help. Her wedding ring glinted faintly as she passed me a heavy bag. I carried the load up her steps, feeling the warmth of the paper handles against my palms. She followed, her perfume, a light trace of vanilla and cedar, catching the evening breeze. As I set the groceries down on her porch, I smiled. "There you go, Mrs. Harris." That's when she paused. Turned. And something softened, or maybe sharpened, in her expression. "Don't call me that," she said with a small, amused huff. "It makes me sound like I'm twice my age." I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden intimacy of her correction. "Then, what should I call you?" Her lips curved, not into a full smile, but the kind that carried history. "Just Anna is fine." Something about the way she said it lingered. A gentle but deliberate shedding of a title that marked distance, respect, and maybe even a kind of barrier. And just like that, the space between us shifted. She thanked me again, fingers brushing mine as she took the last bag. A simple touch, light, fleeting, but enough to send a ripple through the quiet air. I nodded, stepping back onto the path. "Anytime, Anna." She laughed softly at that, shaking her head as though amused by my willingness to adapt so quickly. As I walked back across the street, the sun was already dipping behind the houses, throwing the neighborhood in a warm amber glow. I couldn't quite explain it, but that small exchange had left me strangely awake, as though I'd stumbled onto something quietly alive just a few doors down. The next time we spoke, the sky was a soft wash of gold, the kind that comes just before the evening settles in. I was out front fixing a loose section of my fence when I noticed her, Anna, kneeling in her flower bed across the way, gloved hands buried in the soil. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from a nearby vine, and for a moment, the whole street felt like it had slowed to the rhythm of her careful touch. She glanced up, shielding her eyes from the low sun. "That fence has been leaning for weeks," she called with a teasing lilt. "Finally decided to tame it?" I laughed, brushing the sawdust from my palms. "Guilty. Figured it was time before it falls on someone's cat." She stood, dusting off her gloves, and stepped closer to the low picket line that divided our yards. "You're handier than I expected. Is that a compliment or a surprise?" I asked, matching her smirk. She tilted her head, strands of chestnut hair catching the breeze. "A bit of both." I tightened the hinge with a final turn of the wrench, then glanced up at her. "There. Good as new. Thank you, Mr. She let the word linger, deliberately playful. "Mr. Harris?" I teased, and her brows shot up, amused. "Very funny," she said, a laugh slipping through. "But don't start calling me Mrs. Harris again. I told you, it makes me feel old." I leaned my elbow on the fence. "All right, then what do I call you? Garden Queen? Fence Inspector?" Her lips quirked as she shook her head. "Just Anna. Simple as that." There was something in the way she said it, not annoyed, not cold, but with a quiet insistence that it mattered. Names meant something to her. Titles carried weight. We stood there a little longer than neighbors usually do. The conversation drifted from the jasmine to the unpredictable weather, to the quietness of our street. At some point, she rested her hand on the fence, fingertips drumming lightly against the wood. It was a simple gesture, but my gaze caught it, the way the sun traced the faint lines of her skin, the ring still glinting softly, a reminder of the line between us. "You really do notice everything, don't you?" she said suddenly, catching me mid-thought. I blinked, caught. "I guess I do." Her expression softened, as if that answer pleased her. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of her flowers and something else, that faint, warm trace of her perfume. I stepped back slightly, more to steady myself than anything else. "I'll owe you a coffee for the gate," she said at last, turning toward her porch. "Careful," I said lightly. "I might hold you to that." She gave me one of those looks over her shoulder, brief, amused, unreadable, before disappearing inside. And just like before, I was left standing there, tools in hand, wondering why such ordinary exchanges suddenly felt like they carried weight. The rain started in the early afternoon, the kind that doesn't come with thunder or warning, just a steady, unhurried drizzle that painted the street in silver streaks. By the time I returned from the store, my hoodie was damp at the shoulders, and the sky had already turned the color of wet slate. I spotted her on her porch, Anna, tugging at a cardboard package that had gone soft from the rain. She struggled with the awkward weight of it, one foot keeping the door open behind her. "You'll ruin your back like that," I called, jogging across the slick driveway. She lipped up, a small, relieved sigh leaving her lips. "You again," she said, not unkindly. "Seems I'm in debt to you twice over this week." I caught the package before it tipped and followed her inside. The door closed behind us with a soft thud, sealing out the cool drizzle. The shift was immediate. The smell of brewing coffee, faint vanilla candles, the warm hum of a kitchen that felt lived in but not crowded. "Set it there," she said, pointing to the counter. "Thank you." I nodded, rubbing the rain from my sleeves. "Any time. I didn't mean to intrude." She waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. You've already seen me wrangle groceries. This is nothing." There was a beat of quiet, not awkward, just still. The kettle clicked off behind her, and she turned. "Coffee?" I hesitated only a moment. "Sure." She poured 2 mugs, sliding one toward me across the table. The rain tapped steadily at the window, a soft percussion that seemed to make the world outside blur and fade. We talked, about little things at first. The neighborhood. The overgrown trees by the streetlight. A book she was halfway through. A playlist she liked to put on while cooking. But it was the pauses between words that held the most weight, the way her eyes lingered on mine a second too long, or how she tilted her head slightly when I spoke, as if catching something beneath the surface. "You seem quieter than most around here," she said finally, stirring her coffee with a slow, absent motion. "I like to watch before I speak," I said. "People tell you a lot without saying anything." Her lips curved faintly at that, though her eyes softened in a way that felt heavier than a smile. "I suppose they do." The steam from the coffee rose between us, carrying the faint bitterness of roasted beans. My fingers brushed the ceramic as I shifted the mug, and for a heartbeat, our knees almost touched beneath the table. I told myself it was just proximity, a small kitchen, a rainy day. But the warmth of that near touch lingered. When I finally stood to leave, the rain had slowed to a mist. She walked me to the door, hands wrapped around her mug. "Thank you for the help," she said again, voice quieter now. "Any time, Anna," I replied. Her eyes followed me as I stepped out, the smell of rain rising from the pavement like a memory that didn't know where to settle. Twilight has a way of making the street feel quieter than it really is. That evening, the sky was a muted violet, the last streaks of daylight stretching over the rooftops like fading brushstrokes. I was returning from a jog when I saw her, Anna, sitting on her porch steps, a half-empty cup of tea cradled between her palms. The porch light buzzed faintly above her, casting a soft circle that just reached the edge of the garden. "You're out late," I said, slowing my pace as I passed her gate. She glanced up, a small smile touching her lips but not quite reaching her eyes. "Couldn't stay inside." It's too quiet in there tonight. There was something about the way she said it, not dramatic, just honest. I hesitated at the path, then stepped closer, leaning lightly against the porch railing. Everything okay? She let out a faint laugh, the kind people use when they don't want to sound bitter. You ever feel like you live with someone but barely share a life with them? I stayed quiet, giving her space. The evening breeze stirred the loose strands of her hair, and in that dim light she looked both composed and fragile, like a page that had been folded too many times. I'm sorry, she said quickly, shaking her head. You don't need to hear this. I don't even know why I'm saying it. Because maybe you needed someone to ask, I offered gently. Her fingers tightened around the cup, knuckles pale against the porcelain. He's not a bad man. Just distant. We live parallel lives, I suppose. Same house, different worlds. I nodded slowly. That sounds lonely. Her eyes lifted to mine then, and for the first time, there was no polite veil, just rawness, quiet and real. It is. The words hung there, weighty but not desperate. I wanted to reach out, to close the space between us, but my hands stayed by my sides. There was a line, invisible but sharp, and I wasn't going to be the one to blur it. You don't have to carry it alone, you know, I said softly. She exhaled, a tired smile ghosting across her lips. You listen well for someone your age. I chuckled at that, though my chest tightened at the way her voice wrapped around the words, not teasing, but touched. As she rose to her feet, she passed me the empty cup. Our fingers brushed, just a whisper of skin against skin, but enough to stir the air between us. Thank you, she said, stepping back toward the door. For asking. For not judging. Anytime, Anna, I replied, meaning it more than I expected. The door closed softly behind her, leaving the porch light humming, the night cool and still. I stood there a little longer, feeling the imprint of her words, and that fleeting touch, long after they were gone. The neighborhood gathering had ended hours ago. Paper lanterns still swayed lazily in the warm night breeze, the faint scent of grilled food lingering in the air. Most people had already gone home, their porches dim and quiet, leaving the street wrapped in that peculiar hush only late summer nights seemed to hold. Anna walked beside me, heels clicking softly on the pavement. We'd left together without really planning it, just falling into step after saying goodnight to the others. The road was empty, the stars faint behind the city glow. Strange how quickly those things empty out, she said, glancing at the quiet houses. Guess everyone's got early mornings, I replied, hands shoved in my pockets. She gave a small, amused hum. Including you? Not really, I said, and we both laughed lightly, our voices carrying in the still air. For a while neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like a thin thread pulling us closer. Her shoulder occasionally brushed mine when the sidewalk narrowed. Each time it did, I felt the warmth of it even after we moved apart again. Then, without warning, she stopped walking. Turned to face me with that same half-smile she wore the first day we met. You remember what you said? She asked, her tone both teasing and careful. I frowned slightly. Said when? That day you carried my groceries. You called me Mrs. Harris and then said. She paused, eyes glinting in the porch light of a nearby house. Then what do I call you in bed? The words hit the night air with a softness that felt louder than it should. I let out a quiet laugh, rubbing the back of my neck. I didn't mean it like that, not really. Her eyes didn't waver. I know. We stood there, the cicadas singing somewhere far off, the world suddenly feeling much too still. I didn't move closer, but something in me wanted to. There was a pull, quiet, insistent, like gravity finding the smallest crack to slip through. She looked away first, her breath catching in a way that was almost invisible. You're different, she murmured. Most people your age, they don't carry conversations the way you do. I'm not sure if that's a compliment, I said, voice low, but I'll take it. For a moment, her hand swung close enough that our fingers brushed, just barely, and I felt the heat of it like a spark that shouldn't have been there. Neither of us pulled away too quickly, nor reached again. By the time we reached her gate, the street had gone completely still. "Thank you for the walk," she said softly, her hand on the latch. "Any time, Anna." She lingered for a heartbeat longer, as if something else had been on her lips, then shook her head with a quiet smile and disappeared into the house. And I stood there, in the dark, knowing the air between us had changed, not loudly, not recklessly, but undeniably. The night was still warm, though the hour had turned late. Porch lights flickered in the distance, some already gone dark. I walked Anna to her door after another quiet evening, just conversation on the front lawn, the kind of unplanned moments that kept becoming something more without either of us naming it. She unlocked her door, the key turning with a soft click. For a moment, she didn't step inside. Instead, she stayed there beneath the low glow of the porch light, her fingers lingering on the handle. "Do you ever feel like you've forgotten what it's like to be noticed?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, almost unsure if it should escape the air. I swallowed, the night stretching long between us. "I think we all forget sometimes," I said. "Until someone reminds us." Her eyes met mine, a steady, searching look that held something fragile inside it. Not desperation. Just a quiet, human ache. "I don't want you to think I'm," she began, then paused. "I'm not trying to ask for something I shouldn't. I stepped a little closer, not enough to close the space entirely, but enough that my voice could soften. "You don't need to explain. I understand." Her breath trembled on the exhale. For a heartbeat, I thought she might step back, end it all with a polite smile. Instead, she let her hand slip from the door handle, turning fully toward me. "Then tell me this," she said gently. "What are we doing?" It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one that had hummed beneath every shared glance, every brush of fingers, every pause that lingered too long. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the truth settle between us. "I think," I said finally, "we're just being honest. And careful." Her lips curved at that, not into a smile but into something softer. "Careful," she repeated, almost to herself. Without thinking too hard about it, I reached out. Just a simple gesture, my hand resting lightly at her upper arm, warm against the cool night air. She didn't pull away. "Anna," I said quietly, "you deserve to be seen. And heard. I'm not here to take what isn't mine. I'm just here." For a moment, that was enough. She stepped closer, just a small step, and rested her cheek against my chest. The porch light hummed above us, the street perfectly still. Her heartbeat was slow, steady, almost a whisper against my ribs. I let one hand hover at her back, fingers barely grazing the fabric of her cardigan. I didn't hold her. I simply allowed the moment to exist. After a long breath, she pulled away, not abruptly, but with a kind of reluctant composure. "Thank you," she said softly. "For not rushing it. For not being like the rest." I nodded. "You don't need to thank me." She smiled faintly, her hand brushing the doorframe. "Good night." And with that, the door closed, quietly, gently, leaving me standing on her porch with a heart that felt both heavier and somehow lighter than it had been moments before. Morning sunlight spilled over the neighborhood like a gentle tide, turning dew into faint glimmers across the lawns. It had been a few weeks since that night on her porch, the night where everything hovered between possibility and restraint. Since then, life had settled back into its quiet rhythm. The air between Anna and me hadn't grown colder, it had simply grown steadier. I found her sitting outside on her front steps, a cup of coffee in hand, hair loose around her shoulders, the early breeze teasing a few strands across her face. There was no tension in her posture, no weight pulling at her gaze, only a kind of calm I hadn't seen before. "Morning," I called softly, lifting my own mug as I walked across the street. She smiled, a real one this time, unguarded and warm. "Morning. Coffee?" I took a seat beside her on the steps, careful to leave just enough space for comfort, but close enough that our knees almost brushed when she shifted. The neighborhood was waking up around us, a distant lawnmower, A child's bike rattling along the pavement, the world starting its usual rhythm. "You've been scarce lately," she said, tilting her head. "Trying to give you room," I replied honestly. Didn't want to complicate things. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug, a thoughtful motion. Sometimes space is good. Sometimes it just shows you what matters. I glanced at her, catching the sunlight in her eyes, not searching this time, just present. "And what matters now?" She turned to me fully, the corners of her lips softening. "That I don't feel invisible anymore. That someone saw me, even when I wasn't sure I wanted to be seen." Something in my chest eased at that. Not triumph, just a quiet sense of having been where I was meant to be. She reached out then, fingertips brushing my arm lightly. "Thank you for not making me feel like just a missus." I smiled, the words carrying more than they seemed. "You're far more than that." The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of her jasmine and the warmth of fresh coffee. We sat like that for a while, two neighbors, two lives that had crossed in an unexpected season. No promises were made. No grand declarations. Just a shared understanding that what had grown between us wasn't built on haste, but on presence. As I stood to leave, she rose too, placing a gentle hand against my arm for balance. "You know," she said, her voice quiet but light, "sometimes it's enough to know someone's there. Nothing more, nothing less." I nodded. "And sometimes, that's everything." Her smile lingered as she stepped back, the morning sun catching in her hair. "Enjoy your day." "You too, Anna." I walked back across the street, coffee warm in my hands, heart a little warmer still. The story between us might never be one of labels or expectations, but it had been real, and sometimes, that was the most honest kind of love there is.